thanks for everybody tuning in to this webinar today. It's a continuation of, we're having 6 webinars in the series of ensuring crop pollination for specialty crops in the U.S. And we've had 2 exciting webinars, one on almond pollination, one on high bush blueberries, and today we're going to learn all about pollinating apples and cherries east of the Rockies. And I'd like to mention that this basically has been sponsored by the Bee Health site on eExtension. This is the site where you can tune in and find all kinds of information on bees, beekeeping, and other related topics. So please use the site. It was made for you by a whole bunch of us, and we want you to do that. So I've got to put a plug in on that. I'd like to introduce my co-conspirator in crime, Katharina Ullman. She's out at UC Davis. I'm from Tennessee, by the way, and I'd like Katharina to introduce our speaker of today.
Great, thanks so much, John. I'm really excited that Julianna Wilson is here to present on apples and cherries and their pollinators today. She's the Tree Fruit IPM's outreach specialist at Michigan State University and has over 15 years of research and outreach experience in asparagus, blueberry, biofuels, and of course, tree fruit cropping systems, working both on pollinator communities and pest management in those systems. As with the previous webinars we've done, you can ask Julianna questions using the Q&A question box, which you can find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And she'll be stopping at some point in her talk, I think, to answer a couple of questions, and then we'll have more time at the end of the webinar for her to answer more questions. Similar to last time, we'll be sending out a PDF of the slides for the presentation, and we'll be eventually posting videos of all of these webinars in this series on the Bee Health eExtension YouTube site. Before I pass it over to Julianna, I also want to let folks know that Emily May is in the chat room. She is a colleague of mine from the Xerces Society and was a former graduate student at Michigan State University and has worked extensively in that region. So you might see her share some relevant links over the course of Julianna's presentation. So with that, I want to welcome Julianna and pass it on to her. As we're doing that, Mark is going to put up some poll questions for you to answer. Hopefully we have all the regions covered this time. If you were here last time for the blueberry webinar, you will have seen that at least one region was missing. And the last little thing I want to mention before handing it off is that we do have certified crop advisor credits available for this webinar. You can get 1 crop management credit for this webinar, and we'll be posting a link on the form to fill out to get those credits at the end of Julianna's webinar. So with that, I'll give you some time to fill out this quick poll so we can find out where you're from and what you do, and pass it over to Julianna to share her screen.
Okay. Okay, I think that's, everybody can see that, I think, right?
Yep, yeah, it looks good.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm Julianna Wilson, like Katharina just introduced me. This is my contact information, and it'll be on the last slide as well. And as we mentioned earlier, this is part of the Integrated Crop Pollination webinar series that we're calling, or that's what we're calling it. And I was asked to pick a title and was thinking about what I was going to talk about and what I know the most about, and that would be apples and cherries. And I'm saying east of the Rockies, but it's mainly upper Midwest, Northeast type situations that I'm most familiar with. So that's really the most where the focus will be in these, and a lot about the Michigan data that we have. So let's see here. First, I want to mention that there is a very large team associated with this project, Integrated Crop Pollination Project, and I'm just one of the many team members just from Michigan State. My colleagues here at Michigan are, in Michigan, are Larry Goot in tree fruit specifically, and Nikki Rothwell, but we also had help from a number of different technicians and undergraduates and all that to collect some of the data that I'll be showing. And this project is also has a large advisory panel, and all of the, along the bottom you can see where those members are from. So when we think about orchard pollination, I think that most growers, when I've talked to them about it, are thinking about, they really are only focused on pollination for a very short window of time, and that is necessarily during bloom. But a lot of things go into producing fruit: good horticultural practices, preventing diseases, managing insect and mite pests, and another important component, and without it we wouldn't get that initial fruit set, is adequate pollination. Poor pollination, we know what that looks like. In an apple, it'll be deformed, might be smaller than we're expecting. Good pollination are these beautifully shaped apples. In cherries, there's more of an issue of, like, we're just not getting as much fruit if we're not getting good pollination. So fruit quality and yield are both impacted by poor pollination. So what is integrated crop pollination? That ICP acronym that we've been flashing all over the place here has to do with a set of pollinator integrations and best management practices on the other side of this big flower wheel here. So I'm going to first talk about some of the horticultural practices actually that lead into, that also include, in my mind, the pollination aspect. And we'll talk about managed pollinators, alternative managed bees, and wild bees. And then for the second half, I'll be talking about pesticide stewardship and habitat enhancements. But what it really is about is the use of these combined pollinators and farm practices that are supporting, augmenting, and protecting wild pollinators to provide reliable and economical crop pollination. But it also ties in with health of honeybees. We know that pollination is essential for both pome and stone fruit production. We need bees to move the pollen for both apples and cherries in order for there to be a fruit set. But there are differences between apples and cherries in terms of cross-pollination. Apples definitely need cross-pollination. They're not self-compatible, so you usually are, in an orchard, you'll often see crab apples interplanted with the variety that you're trying to grow, but there are also compatible cultivars that are sometimes intercropped, like every other row or every few rows there might be a compatible cultivar planted with these apples. In cherry, the same situation is true for sweet cherries, but I'm going to focus mainly on tart cherries in this talk because that's a major crop here in Michigan. But sweet cherries also need a compatible cultivar for cross-pollination. Tart cherries are self-compatible, but they still benefit greatly from the movement of pollen by, the pollen itself is moved mostly by pollinators, by bees, but it also can be as a consequence of wind bumping branches and flowers against each other. There's some transfer of pollen that way as well. Here's a tart cherry orchard in northern Michigan in full bloom. It's a beautiful sight, but this window of time when we need pollinators to do the job and to get adequate pollination is really, really short, especially for tart cherries. It may be less than a week. In apples, it might be slightly longer, but the time period when those flowers are viable and ready to accept pollination is pretty short. And so why might pollination fail? And some of you might already have guessed, might already have a lot of experience with this. Incompatible pollen. Weather is a big big component of pollination failure in orchards, and then having too few pollinators. So pollination failure, the pollen source, if you talking about apples and sweet cherries again, with incompatible pollen, you are going to have problems getting apples to size and to be the right shape. So pollinizers intercropped are really important. There are a lot of resources online for figuring out which cultivars are compatible with one another. These are just a couple of screenshots of resources that the University of Missouri Extension puts out. So, for instance, they've got a bloom period chart, and you can see where so you probably wouldn't, some of these all of these pretty much overlap in bloom to a certain extent, but there will be some that are more or less overlapping. And then here on the right is a chart of just cultivar by whether it would be suitable as a pollinizer for another cultivar that you might be interested in planting next to it. Similarly, for sweet cherries, there are charts available for looking at different cultivars and their best compatible pollinizer. Another major component of orchard pollination failure and just crop failure in general is weather. Minimizing cold damage. There are lots of different strategies for doing that, but the first one and the most important probably before you even plant the orchard is to get a good site, is the best site that you can possibly get, especially in the north, where you're going to want a hilly site, someplace where you can have cold air draining out of the orchard and into what you're going to create, which are frost pockets. You can also get frost pockets up against wood lots. We have a lot of wood lots in Michigan, and I know across Pennsylvania and New York there are also where the landscape is really pretty diverse in terms of agriculture. There are lots of different land uses, but you're trying to avoid areas where you're trying to minimize the potential settling of cold air on your crop, on the trees. Then there are several different mechanical strategies you can use to minimize cold damage. They mainly have to do with inversion layers that I'm not going to really explain too much about, but you can look up more information on inversion layers on your own. But it's really just generally trying to pull warm air down from a layer that's higher in the atmosphere using something like either helicopters or frost fans. A lot of growers in Michigan have started to install frost fans for this purpose. It's mainly just to mix the air and to increase the temperature in the orchard if possible during an inversion event. Another way to minimize cold damage in fruit crops is to apply a layer of ice, basically to have ice form on the crop. But in an orchard, there's a risk that limbs can break, especially in small limbed, in the high density orchards. So this isn't usually a technique that's used widely. I think in this situation, this image is actually of a pear orchard. So pear trees tend to be a lot more structurally massive in terms of their trunks and limbs. So they're more likely to do something like this. But in apple and even in cherry too, that coverage of ice is usually more done by applying a layer of ice on the orchard floor. So with mist sprayers that are used during the season for irrigation, they might also use those for creating a layer of ice, because anytime water is changing into a different state, it's releasing some heat to do that. And so you're basically just trying to increase the temperature in your orchard by a few degrees at a time when it's really critical. And this is usually mostly before bloom. So this is that really early spring when you're trying to protect the buds that have become sensitive to cold. They've come out of dormancy and they're susceptible to cold damage. And not just frost, but just low temperatures. During bloom, you can have weather issues as well. It's often really cold in the spring. It might be really rainy. I didn't actually list that here, but cold, wet weather is not good for pollination. The pollinators themselves, it might be too cold for them to fly when the flowers are viable. And most bees don't fly actually below 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Bumblebees are able to actually generate their own heat and continue to fly at lower temperatures than honeybees and some of the smaller bees. But honeybees in general will wait around until the air temperatures is about 60 degrees Fahrenheit before flying. There are some exceptions to that rule. So if it's a really sunny day and they've been cooped up in the hive for a few days because of bad weather, they will fly at somewhat lower temperatures. But wild bees, wild native bees that we have in our area are more adapted to early spring temperatures, and so they are likely to be active at earlier in the morning and also at lower temperatures than when honeybees would be. But then the flip side is the plant. The plant might be unable to grow the germ tube from that pollen grain down to the ovaries before the flower loses viability. So even if you had pollinators flying and then you just got some more cold weather that could delay or slow that germ tube growth, then you can have problems with pollination even though you had enough pollinators. So one of the strategies for minimizing these kinds of losses are through the use of irrigation to actually delay bloom. So Jim Flory here at Michigan State University Horticulture has used some of this overhead sprinkling systems. This is really in a high density apple orchard where it would be probably the most cost effective to use a system like this. But he was able to delay bloom by up to 2 weeks, and just that short amount of time can prevent, in some cases, can shift that window of risk basically so that you're not running up against cold events that can produce loss or make it harder for pollination to be successful. And then of course another pollination failure could be lack of pollinators. One of the easiest strategies to remedy this situation is of course to add more managed pollinators, and the biggest one, the most common used managed pollinator in orchards, especially in Michigan, are honeybees. They're rented for their pollination services, and they're active as long as the weather is favorable. They're perennial. They're pollinating many crops, so they're usually coming into Michigan. They may be coming from almond pollination, or they might have gone back down to Florida and then come back up to Michigan for pollination. But they do a lot of traveling, especially the commercial beekeepers. They're portable. That's why we love them. You can put thousands of them out in a situation and get pollination. And honeybees actually seem to really like going into orchards. The flowers are easy to handle, the nectar is really readily available, so I think that they don't really have a problem. Unlike some other crops like blueberry, if you were on that webinar last week, blueberry has some issues with attracting honeybees sometimes. Some cultivars do. As far as stocking density recommendations, there's a lot of this information is really pretty old, and I didn't get a chance to ask the growers in my area like how many they're now currently stocking, but there is such a range of density recommendations. In apple, it could be a quarter, basically 1 hive per 4 acres, or up to 5 hives per acre, which is an average of about 1.5 hives. And then in cherries, there are density recommendations for 1/2 to or 1 hive per 2 acres, or 5 hives per acre. Why is there such a range? Well, there are some cultivar differences, but really it kind of comes down to the abundance or the lack of wild pollinators. So if you have a lot of wild pollinators coming into your orchards, you won't need as many honeybees. And this is especially true from our colleagues. David Bittinger at Penn State University has found that most growers don't actually bring in honeybees because they get plenty of pollination from the wild pollinators in the surrounding, coming in from the surrounding landscape. And we'll talk more about those a little later in the talk. Bumblebees are another managed bee that are sometimes purchased for pollination, for crop pollination outside. I don't know as many growers that are using this pollinator for orchards. I know they're using it more in some in blueberries. The colonies that you purchase are going to be out of sync with natural colonies. So in early spring orchards, the bumblebees you'll see naturally are really just queens at that point because it's just so early in the season. So these are the queens that are establishing new colonies, and they have to get resources to build up those colonies. So here you can see an image of the inside of a bumblebee hive. This is actually a commercial hive, but the queen is much larger than the workers. The workers actually vary in size quite a lot, from tiny little ones to about the half size of the queen, and their nest is just a jumble of waxy cells like this. Copert is just one, is the U.S. Company that produces these, and they're located in Howell, Michigan. This is actually 4 colonies in here. If you've never seen one of these commercial hives before, they're actually these are entrances to individual colonies on this one side. We usually expect to get about 6 to 8 weeks of activity from a single colony. They're portable for the lifespan of the colony, but once they're done, they're done. You don't really get extended usability from these hives. And I keep calling them hives, but they're really just colonies. Orchard mason bees are another managed pollinator that have been used in Japan for cherry pollination in particular for quite some time. There's a lot of interest in these bees in a variety of different areas. We have some native mason bees. The blue orchard mason bee is a native pollinator, Osmia. Wow, I'm blanking on the species name, but anyway, there's also a Osmia species that is from Japan that is either called the horn-faced bee or the Japanese orchard bee. But what these bees do is they're actually solitary. They don't form a colony, but they will nest in large aggregations. They require some management with temperature and sanitation of nesting materials. But you can see the picture of the tubes with the mud caps. That is what their nest looks like. They will also nest in bamboo and straws, but the nest diameter is really important for different species. They'll just prefer certain nest diameters. So, but they're particularly suited for orchard pollination. They naturally occur early in the spring, and they are active for about 4 weeks. And they're portable after the nesting is completed. So this other image on the bottom is of cocoons that you can actually remove from the nesting material and store in a place that will help you minimize mites that like to get into these nests and also prevent parasitism. But they take a little bit of finesse to get them to work, and I think we're working on in about a year probably we'll have how to manage these bees on your own. We do have some growers in Michigan that have been working with these bees on their own farms and storing them basically in a pole barn over the winter. They're really just interesting bees. So this lack of pollinators issue can be improved through the use of managed bees, but you can also improve conditions for wild pollinators to boost up their numbers. And I'm going to go into that a lot more in the second part, but just to introduce you to the wild bees that you can find in orchards. We know that there are more than 80 species that are active during spring bloom here in Michigan, and I know that's probably similar in New York and Pennsylvania and elsewhere. Most of these species are actually solitary bees, and they're nesting in the soil, often right under the trees in those weed-free strips in orchards, and they're only really limited by the abundance of flowers that bloom before and after the crop blooms. So if you're thinking about like a cherry or an apple orchard, the willows and other woody flowering plants that are going to be in those in the woodlots, in the edges of the woodlots, those will be used by some of these bees that before the crop comes into bloom. And there are some arguments about whether they compete with honeybees, but for the most part, it looks like they actually increase the pollination efficiency of honeybees by disrupting the honeybees' behavior, their natural tendency to trap line or go systematically down a row. If you're trying to move pollen, especially in cross-pollination, you want the honeybee to move around more than just straight down a row. So these bees actually cause there to be more jumping around of the honeybees. The most important group for apples and cherries are the Andrena bees, the digger bees. There are a number of different species. They're only active for about 3 to 4 weeks, and then they spend the rest of the season underground in their nests. And I've actually had a question from Agora this last week about, what happens if you are managing a planting next to an orchard, and I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but if you're burning vegetation, basically, they're nesting. These bees are nesting about between 6 inches to maybe 3 feet down, depending on the species. So they're really well protected or insulated by the soil from management practices that you might be having to implement on a habitat. So this slide just shows the pollinators that we observed during bloom across 16 cherry orchards and 5 apple orchards from 2013 to 2015, and these are all tart cherry orchards in across, actually, not just northern Michigan, but in southwest Michigan too. But you can see just how much variability there is in terms of the average number of pollinators we saw during the time frame where we were observing. The yellow in the bars are honeybees. Then we have orange for bumblebees that we saw. Other bees are in green, and then syrphid flies are in blue. And we count syrphid flies in this situation because we're pretty sure that they can do some pollination as well, just by incidentally visiting the flowers and moving pollen from their body to another flower. They're not packing on the pollen like a bee does, but they're still capable of providing some pollination in these open flowers that we know orchards have. So, but just really, this is just an illustration of the variability. And the honeybees we assume they're all from managed hives. So the variability in number of honeybees is likely due to, for the most part, to how many hives the growers are stocking, and then, well, and also how close we were to those hives when we were doing the observations, honestly. But for the most part, it's stocking density differences. But wild bees are also, in the tart cherry orchards anyway, are really pretty abundant. So I'm going to stop here with just a summary slide and take time for a few questions. But really what I've just been talking about are good horticultural practices that will improve pollination, site selection in the first place, compatible cultivars for apples and sweet cherries, cold and frost protection strategies for minimizing cold damage, and then increasing pollinators by stocking with managed bees as needed, and just awareness of wild bees that are potentially on your farm.
Great, thanks, Juliana. We have one question in right now in the Q&A box. If others have some questions at this moment, go ahead and enter them into the Q&A box. Otherwise, we'll get back to them at the end of the webinar. Catherine is asking about preventing frost damage in very small orchards. She asks, to prevent frost damage in a very small orchard, for example, 10 trees, can you just use a blanket or tarp?
Yeah, you probably could in a small situation like that. I mean, people use that in like a home garden situation all the time. Blankets over to protect from a frost event, if you know a frost event is imminent. Yep, and some people have also, I've seen people put up tarps that are actually vertical, so that if they know cold air is going to be draining into an area, if they just happen to be planted in a lower spot, they can divert that cold air around the orchard. I've seen that done too.
We also have a question from Lori that just came into the chat box, and she's asking, does any one bee seem more successful at pollinating on apples or cherries? Or do you know anything about sort of, is there a best bee for apples and cherries?
So yeah, you're asking about pollination efficiency on a per bee basis. Well, unlike blueberry that has a floral morphology that's really restrictive of the pollen and takes a bee that's able to handle it. I mean, apple and cherry flowers and rosaceae in general, raspberries, strawberries in that case too, the open flower plan makes them really accessible. And so I don't know that there is any particular pollinator that's going to be more efficient at moving the pollen for those particular flowers. But we know that pollen bees, or the solitary bees, they're also sometimes called pollen bees, they're not collecting nectar like honeybees to build up a honey store. And so since they're more focused on pollen collection, they're thought to be more efficient just because they're handling more pollen, or they're more interested, because some component of a honeybee hive is going to be really focused. Those foragers are going to be really focused on nectar collection, and then there might be other foragers that are focused on pollen collection. But in a solitary bee situation, she's collecting nectar really to provide herself with energy and also to mix a little bit with the pollen, but she's handling those flowers mainly to collect pollen for feeding her offspring.
Thanks, Juliana. We have a couple more questions, but given that we're about halfway through the webinar, I was thinking we'd move on and get back to these questions at the end of the talk.
Sure. Okay, so now I'm going to move into pesticide stewardship, basically. So how do we minimize harm to bees without compromising pest and disease management? This is a big issue for, well, any crop that's relying on pollinators, but at the same time, are there ways we can increase wild pollinator populations that service orchards? And so some of the points to consider are that most farms grow a variety of different cultivars that bloom at different times. So when you think about pesticide labels in particular, pre-bloom and petal fall may be different in adjacent blocks. So blocks that are right next to each other might be at different stages and requiring different management strategies. Fungicides are critical during bloom to maintain disease. Here in the East, we have an abundance of water, which is a really great thing for growing good fruit, and we don't have to irrigate as much, but we also, that means we have high humidity, and a lot of diseases are critical for control during bloom. Insecticide residual activity, timing of applications, and potential drift are all important things to consider in orchard production systems, and when you're thinking about beneficial insects in general. Now, fungicides are, like I said, very important for early spring disease management. In cherries, there's the cherry leaf spot. It can cause severe defoliation and tree decline. It basically gives your orchard just will not last as long as if you were managing it, because it's not able to produce, it loses leaves, and it just can't produce the photosynthetes that it needs to produce more fruit to keep the tree healthy. Apple scab is a major infection during that's actually affecting the tree for beyond bloom, but the initial applications of fungicides are right around bloom time. And so in the past, fungicides by themselves were considered safe based on lab-based toxicology studies, and these are you can get LD50s for all of these materials from these studies, and LD50 is just the lethal dose that will kill half of a population that is being tested. And so, but the issue now is that there's new research that are identifying sublethal effects of fungicides on colony health, by colony health, I'm really referring to honeybees in this case, because that's what the organism that has been tested the most and that we know the most about. So we know, for instance, that this is actually not a very recent study, but 1993 published study that looked at the combination of pyrethroids, which are insecticides, with fungicides, and showed that the toxicity of the pyrethroids are increased beyond what they would normally, what we would normally think they would be doing. And then the miticides that are actually used in hives to control the varroa mite, which is a serious pest of honeybees and transmits diseases and causes lots of havoc for beekeepers. They have to use miticides to control that pest, but in combination with fungicides, they're showing some synergistic negative effects of fungicides with the miticides. It's looking like fungicides might be interfering with detoxification and interfering with disease, nosema immunity in particular. There's increased larval mortality being shown with some fungicide use, and that might be due to gut microbe interference, because honeybees need to process the pollen and the nectar into something called bee bread, and it's a fermentation process that requires those gut microbes to complete. So if they're not able to produce a high quality food, then you're going to have more larval death. So this is what we're starting to find with fungicides. Of course, insecticides are a known quantity in terms of we know that they're toxic to bees at varying levels, but most studies, we know how toxic they're expected to be for honeybees. On wild bees, a lot less is known. It's still, but we can assume that it's probably not good. These are insecticides. They're meant to kill insects, and bees, of course, are insects. So most insecticides are actually restricted from use during crop bloom in orchards, but drift onto non-crop flowers can occur at times. At other times, if care is not taken. New labels have come out within the last few years now, I guess, from the EPA that includes this little icon of a bee. It's to alert users that this particular material is known to be particularly hazardous to bees, and there are special cautions about how to use it it's just mainly to alert people, to give them more something more to work with when they're considering how and when to apply pesticides. I don't know if these kinds of labels have been put on home use products, and it would be good if they were, if they're not already, but this is mainly for restricted use pesticides. You have to have a license to be able to apply some of these pesticides. Herbicides don't necessarily have, you wouldn't be spraying herbicides on a bee, you wouldn't want to, but the main problem with them is that are indirect effects on bees when floral diversity is diminished in and around crops. So if you think about the corn and soybean belt of the US, that what has happened there is a loss of floral diversity and through the use of herbicides that just make it nice, really clean, easy to cultivate fields. So of course herbicides are an important tool for managing weeds at different times, but they can be somewhat overused as well. So recommended best practices. During bloom, or pre-bloom I should say, when you're working with a beekeeper in particular, it's really good to clarify expectations on both ends. Record keeping is essential. Commercial growers are expected, they keep spray records, but it's also important that the beekeepers keeping good records so if any problems do come up, can go back and look at what might have happened. Delivery date of the hives and approximate removal of the hives are really important. Sometimes that is just not communicated between, it might be communicated between the owner, the orchard owner and the beekeeper, but not his applicator, the orchard owner, I should say, he or she's applicator, pesticide applicator. So you need to know when those hives are being brought in so there's no exposure. Re-entry intervals, for instance, are really important if you know you're going to be applying a pre-bloom insecticide spray. Hive strength is important. We're expecting in Michigan 6 to 8 strong frames with 70 to 75% capped brood cells. And where you place those hives are important too. I think the general expectation or recommendation in the past has been to just disperse them throughout the orchard for the best pollination, but really honeybees move where there's food, and you don't need to put them in harm's way by putting them in the orchard. It's better to put them in the orchard edges, upwind from where they might be sprayed on accidentally or where drift might occur. When the bees are delivered, I was just talking about this, upwind from potential drift is the place where you want to put them in the orchard margins. Honeybees are excellent flyers, so you don't need to put them throughout the hive to maximize. They will accomplish the goal of pollination on the edges, from the edges. During bloom, following current labels is important. Labels are updated sometimes annually, depending on the pesticide. Selecting the least toxic pesticides where possible can also help with minimizing pesticide exposure for bees. Calibrating your sprayer to target according to the target orchard. So if you're spraying a high density orchard versus a more standard large tree orchard, those are going to require different sprayer calibrations, because when you're trying to maximize coverage and minimize drift, that calibration is going to be really critical. And there are some really great resources out there now for calibrating the sprayer in an orchard situation coming out of Ontario. And I don't think I included that here, but I would be happy to share that with whoever's interested in those materials. And then the other way to minimize a harm is to spray when bees are less active. So temperatures below 55 or after sunset are better times to spray a fungicide, for instance, or any pesticide in the orchard. Turning off the sprayer when near hives, avoiding pesticide drift onto open flowers, avoiding the use of any insecticides during bloom while bees are actively visiting flowers. Post-bloom, communication with the beekeeper, again, about when the hives are going to be removed before going in and doing and applying pesticide sprays against orchard pests is really important. Minimizing flowers in the orchard floor, you can use selective herbicides or by mowing before spraying. I know I just said herbicides are overused in some cases, but for when you're trying to minimize harm to pollinators, eliminating those the flowers in the orchard floor by mowing or by selective herbicides is a good thing. Calibrating your sprayer, again, to avoid pesticide drift on open flowers and adjacent habitat. And then planting non-crop flowers outside of the orchards will also help bees in a variety of ways. You can use native perennial plants following some of the Natural Resource Conservation Service tech guides, or you can use summer blooming cover crops like buckwheat, sunflowers, some things like that will actually draw the bees out of the orchard and will provide them with more flowering resources. Bees with access to diverse pollen and nectar sources are known to live longer, they have greater reproduction potential, they can cope better with diseases, and they're able to detoxify pesticides better. So all these things these are all positive reasons to incorporate more flowers outside of the orchard. This is a typical orchard margin in Michigan. There are some flowering resources in there because it hasn't been recently mowed. You can see white clover, some red clover in there, some hieracum, I think that's how you say it, some yellow flowers that we know bees like. But and this is next to a woodlot, and again in that woodlot we're flowering trees and shrubs at the beginning of the season. But what we're proposing is that for orchards that have this space, and also in low-lying areas especially, so where you wouldn't place an orchard because you're bound to get those cold, hard frosts or cold damage on a regular basis, you might plant something like this instead. So these are native flowering plants for the upper Midwest and also east of here. You can see at this stage there's a lot of black-eyed Susan, but even just not mowing an area, letting it grow up, there will be a lot of flowering resources in that area that bees will use. So in this case, we had Horiolisum and daisies that are not native, but definitely were providing floral resources. So what we, as part of the ICP project, we put these plantings in, and then we wanted to know, what bees are we collecting, are visiting the cherry orchards in this case, and what are visiting the plantings, and is there any overlap? Because when we think about temporally the bloom time, there's not a lot of overlap. I mean, there isn't any overlap between when the orchards are blooming and when these plantings are blooming. So what we found was really was surprising and also happy, which was that we found about 80 different species. Of those 80 species that are visiting the cherry orchards, we found 22 shared with the wildflower plantings that were adjacent. So in the wildflower plantings, we found a total of 47 species, and 22 of those are shared with the blooming orchard. And honeybees were also using these plantings as well, so we just wanted to point that out. So there, where we counted the number of honeybees, we just didn't collect them because we know what they look like. The other thing that these plantings do is provide more nesting resources. So when you clear some ground and put these plantings in, it makes room for, or it seems to attract in these the soil nesting bees that we know are also good for pollinating orchards. So here just is a digger bee going down into her nest, and this is a nest hole, and you can see some emergence holes from another site. So this is the summary slide for that section, which is just that pesticide stewardship starts with really good communication with your beekeeper, if you are using a beekeeper. And locating the hives upwind from potential drift will minimize a lot of harm. Calibrating sprayers so that they're not, they're focusing on the target and not drifting off of target. Selecting pesticides and application times that minimize harm to bees. Keeping good records of pesticide use. And then habitat enhancements. You can plant non-crop flowering plants outside of orchards that will benefit all pollinators, not just wild bees, but also honeybees. It improves their nutrition, their access to alternative pollinator sources, and it also draws them out of the orchard and out of harm's way, potential harm's way. I guess before I do that, are there any other questions, or do we want to just wait till the end?
I think let's go ahead and wait until your last couple of slides. And then
okay, so in summary, apples and cherries need bees for good yields and marketable fruit. Site selection and cultivar combinations are really important, especially in terms of apples for cultivar combinations. Cold protection strategies prior to and during bloom are also important. Managed bees are likely a good investment in most locations, and I say that because we know that in Pennsylvania orchards, a lot of growers their orchards are small enough, or they have enough semi-natural habitat around them that they don't require honeybee, the purchase or the rental of honeybee hives. But here in Michigan, most growers do use them. Wild bees can be very abundant at different sites, especially again near semi-natural habitat. Using best management practices to minimize harm to pollinators while controlling diseases and pests is important. And then consider incorporating non-crop flowers on the farm. Here are just a few resources for going forward. We have a nice bulletin that was just published. I guess now it's been a year and a half, but this is minimizing pesticide risk to bees and fruit crops. And in the back of that booklet, you can get it as a free PDF online. So if you just Google minimizing pesticide risk to bees in fruit crops, you'll find it. But there are a series of tables in the back that list the relative toxicity of different pesticides that are registered for use in Michigan. You'll have to check in your own state if if you're listening in from outside of Michigan, to look at what's registered for use in your area, because I know there are differences. And then there's a new pocket guide for farmers and gardeners and landscapers that has really nice pictures of the bees that we find in agricultural landscapes in the north central region, and also in the east. A lot of these bees are going to be found in the east as well. And then on the Integrated Crop Pollination Project website, there are lots of resources for growers. There are videos and other links to all kinds of resources, but we just put out a couple of really simple 2-page fact sheets recently, one on apple pollination and one on cherry pollination. They say Michigan, they are very Michigan focused, but they would, a lot of the same, they would also apply readily to, other eastern, northeastern crops, orchard crops. And this is my last slide with my contact information, and again, that icpbees.org website. I think that's still, you can get to Project ICP that way. I'm not sure.
Yeah, you can.
Okay.
That's right. Yeah.
Just to confuse people, 2 different websites, but yeah. Okay, so that's it.
Great. Thanks so much, Juliana. So we have a few minutes here for questions. We have 2 right now lined up in the Q&A box. If others have additional questions for Juliana, go ahead and post them, ideally in the Q&A box, but if they show up in the chat box, we will hopefully catch them there too. Juliana, we had Crystal asking about the slide you showed earlier in your talk related to the kinds of different bees found in cherry and apple orchards. It was a graph, a bar graph. And Crystal asked if you have a version of that slide that doesn't include honeybees, so people can just see the variation in wild bees on farms. And her follow-up question to that was, what are the kinds of farm features, or can you highlight again the sort of the main farm management practices that might lead some tree fruit orchards to have more wild bees than other tree fruit orchards?
Yeah, okay, so I don't have a graph, but that would be easy to make, one without honeybees, and so I can supply that after the fact here. And then the other is with respect to what are sort of the features of an orchard that's going to have more wild bees than others. And I think that so in this picture right here on this, this is one of our ICP farms, and these flowers were planted in a low spot in a depression, but it was also surrounded by a bunch of, I think he had woodlots here and there. There were also, he was planting cover crops that are flowering intentionally for providing food for bees. And this is one of this particular farm had a lot of wild bees on it. So I think that it's really just about having safe spaces for and alternative resources beyond your crop that the bees can use, that are going to probably be that will predict whether you have native bees or not. But you can also, during bloom, watch, go out on a nice day when the weather is, when it's not too windy and it's sunny, and you can count the number of bees that are visiting and look for some of these wild bees. I mean, there are green bees that I didn't really talk too much about. But mostly you're going to find Andrena and some bumblebees, but the Andrena are those digger bees or the mining bees. I guess that's kind of a rambling answer. But semi-natural habitat is definitely strongly associated with wild bee abundance and species richness.
And I think there's also some evidence coming out of the Cornell lab in New York showing that it can also buffer, protect bees from exposure to pesticides. So you end up getting bees more protected in those instances too. Is that right, Juliana?
Yeah, and I mean we would expect that that these would help. Like, so planted areas, intentionally planted flowering areas, or areas where outside of that orchard will help draw those bees out of harm's way. So that's, I would imagine that definitely more semi-natural areas where you're not growing a crop that's having agricultural inputs applied to it will provide safe havens, basically, for bees of all kinds.
We also had some questions come up in the chat box around bumblebees and whether you think they manage bumblebees, whether you think that would be something for growers to explore in their orchard setting. Someone from Minnesota had heard from a grower that there wasn't a ton of success with that. I think maybe they heard it work well in one orchard. And I guess I'm just wondering, from your experience with tree fruit growers in Michigan, have you met any tree fruit growers that have been using managed bumblebees, and what has their experience been within the apple and char cherry systems that you work in?
Yeah, I only know of one grower that has used bumblebees, and he used them in combination with honeybees. So I don't know like what contribution they made to the overall crop and quality of the crop, but he felt like they were, he was really interested in, how do you know how many to stock? Because if you think about a bumblebee colony, I didn't mention this when I was in my talk, but really there might be about 100 workers. The expectation would be there'd be about 100 workers compared to 40,000 workers in a honeybee hive. And then there are some handling efficiency calculations where we know that, for instance, bumblebees handle more flowers per minute than honeybees do, like they're moving among flowers more quickly. So you can we know, I know more about their use in blueberries actually than in orchards, just because more work has been done on we know how many pollen grains they deposit per visit and how many flowers they handle per minute. So we know that it's like 12 honeybees to one bumblebee worker in terms of efficiency of a ratio. So then you can calculate from there, in blueberries anyway, like how many boxes you would need. If you expect maybe half of those workers to actually be out foraging, that's 50 workers compared to 20,000 honeybees that are out foraging. So it's really, I don't know that it makes good economic sense unless you are really limited in your availability of honeybees in your area as a managed pollinator for orchard pollination. It's hard to track where they're going in the orchard because they're just usually at much lower densities. It's kind of there's still a lot we don't know about, like even just how many to stock in an orchard to make it worthwhile.
Great, thanks so much, Juliana. If there's any other questions, Kathy will follow up with your question offline in the interest of time. But if there's any other questions that people have, feel free to put it in the Q&A box. And Juliana will get to it before we send out the slides for the presentation today. We have a closing poll for people to answer, and I'm gonna post the link for CCA credits into the chat box. And with that, I'll pass it over to John to wrap things up. And thanks again, Juliana.
Thanks, Katerina.
I'd like to thank Juliana very much too for an excellent presentation. And I'd like to make sure that everybody's aware that we will have another webinar on the 28th where Neil Williams from UC Davis will talk about on-farm pollinator habitat benefits for watermelon. So if you are interested in learning more about watermelon pollination, please tune in for that one. I appreciate all of you for attending the webinar, and I hope it was of some use to you.
And I just Sorry, I just put a link for the watermelon pollination webinar in chat. And,
Thank you, Mark.
Sure, and the poll is up still for folks, so we'll give folks a little bit of time to finish that up.
And we're gonna leave this webinar open just for a couple of more minutes to about 12:02, in case you have any other questions that you want to answer, or if it takes you a second to fill out these polls. But thanks again, everyone, for joining us. We hope you enjoyed it.
Katerina, we had the question from Lori about ice tides. You want me to say something about that, or?
Sure. If you, we can do that as we close things up here. The question from Lori was sort of asking about the longevity of any kind of pesticide, herbicide, fungicide, and won't bees get exposed to that if they're sitting on the surface?
Okay, well, it's possible, yes, but it all depends. It has to be available to the pollinator, and where is the bee going and where is it contacting? So it would have to be directly onto the flowers for the most part, because you don't see pollinators going to leaves or other parts of the plant that may have been sprayed by some kind of chemical. So if it hits directly on the blossom, then yes, they could pick up something. But it's a hit or miss thing. And if the proper management is taken care of to where you do not spray when you have open blooms, and you spray when the bees are not there, very often it's no longer available to the bee when they do come in and visit. So there are strategies to look at to avoid contact with the chemicals, or not even spraying at all, unless you really have to do it.
Great. I think I just want to make one more note. Kathy, we saw your question in the Q&A box, and we see your chat in the chat box. We'll make sure that John sees it, and I'll also make sure that Juliana sees it, and they'll respond when we send out the slides for the presentation. So look out for more communication on that question.
I sent her a message, but unfortunately I didn't send it to everybody else, and I don't know what happened to it. So I'll talk to her. She just sent me something, and about that specific work. So
yeah, we'll definitely follow up with you, Kathy, and others will get to see that conversation chain when we send out the slides for the presentation. We're almost at 5 minutes after the hour now, so we're going to close up this webinar. Thanks again, everyone, for coming, and hopefully we'll see some of you during the watermelon webinar on the 28th.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.